Um, as Ron said, a couple of the fun expansions that we have coming up over the next couple of years, and particularly focus on for this week, is one of them is small institutions. So happy to introduce Jason Sims, who's now a co-PI on the FabAid project, who's going to talk about kind of the view and the landscape from small institutions. Jason.
Well, thank you, Brian. And, first of all, I have to apologize a little bit. The plane ride here and the barometric pressure bomb that I've fallen into is wreaking havoc with my sinuses a little bit. So I do apologize for that. But yes, I'm very thrilled to be here. I've wanted to attend this event for many years, and the stars have finally aligned to allow me to do it. So I'm really thrilled to be here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about a sort of small campus perspective. So what do I mean by that? Well, in some ways, by small campuses, we mean anything other than R1. But of course, that's a huge ecosystem of institutions. And so the first assertion that I'm going to make is that I'm not speaking for non-R1s. I'm not trying to say that my statements here today are reflective of the truths that you will find at all of these campuses, or that we are one homogeneous group, because we absolutely are not. And then the second assertion that I'll make as sort of a preamble is that the challenges that such campuses face, I'm also not saying that they are limited to that community. We all face many versions of these challenges, whether R1 or not. But what I will state is that the solution set for smaller institutions is often very different from what you would see from larger institutions. It doesn't mean it's worse or better or whatever. It just means that sometimes it's different. And so we have to think about how we approach these barriers and opportunities in some ways differently than the larger institutions can. So the reality is that the scale that making productive contributions to science now requires, or in some cases even to access updated hardware for smaller institutions. And by the way, I should say, within that spectrum of smaller institutions, I am coming from the perspective of the smaller end of that scale, from the liberal arts institutions, the more teaching-focused institutions, because that is my kind of own background, even though I did my own work at very large R1 state schools. But I found myself professionally working mostly within the smaller school system. But nonetheless, accessing these resources and making good contributions to science sometimes now requires off-campus resources. That's just kind of the reality that many small schools face. And I do think that the OSPool and similar services, really offer that lacking capacity for smaller institutions. But adoption of these services is often limited far less by the capacity than it is by facilitation, workflow fit, and trust. And so what I'm going to do is talk really about three things. It's kind of a little bit of a hodgepodge. I'm going to kind of dive into why that local is not necessarily enough anymore. We're going to talk a little bit about the shifting funding landscape. Most of us are very embedded within that reality. We're going to talk about some of the challenges limiting the ability to kind of move extramurally for smaller institutions. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the OSPool and other national resources becoming more of a first order priority for smaller institutions. Well, why does this matter? Well, I think, as Marone and others have alluded to, 70% roughly, depending on the numbers you look at, of US undergraduates attend non-R1 institutions. So that's a huge pool, right? Many students who ultimately go on to R1 graduate work come from these institutions, particularly these smaller liberal arts focused institutions that are a real pipeline into some of these graduate programs. And we have to prepare them for when they're going to be in that environment and doing that graduate work. Marone also mentioned the workforce conversation, the workforce development thing, which has become indeed a buzzword for governments of all scales, state, local, federal government, all of that. Well, here are the students. These are the people who are going to be your future workforce. And I think also something that gets lost in this discussion, which I think we need to do better by, are the community colleges. They are often in vocational preparation, and we need to be offering them hands-on, much more engaged methodologies so that they are ready to enter this kind of new workforce, this new paradigmatic shift that we've experienced over the last 5 to 7 years or so. I think that the funding ground, as we're all aware, is shifting. I knew several campuses. I've benefited from them myself, where the reality was that if you wanted a cluster, if you wanted to kind of up your game for computational research, you would get a CC star. You might get a planning grant that turned into a compute grant. You might get an MRI funding grant to spin up a local cluster. And this was great. And a lot of these still persist. My own is kind of one of those that came out of that. But the new reality, I think, of a lot of funding agencies is that we're going to see fewer but larger grants. These are often going to be for shared services. They're going to be for regional, national, collaborative efforts, these kind of things. Because what is getting harder is, again, capital grants to buy specific systems for a single campus. Funding is going to be less, I think, spread across a bunch of smaller campuses and smaller rewards. And it's going to just become more challenging to justify local hardware for a whole host of reasons. But what we do hope to still see is funding for campus networking and connectivity upgrades, because there are a lot of smaller institutions that, even if there are pooled resources available, if they can't get to them, if they can't get data to or from them, that's not going to be too much of a benefit. And so we have to still see grants that are going to support those kind of necessary infrastructure updates, providing those on-ramps that lets you then reach and contribute to these shared resources. And so the implication is that we're going to have to see smaller campuses especially plan to consume the capacity, not necessarily to own the capacity. On-prem in this kind of ecosystem has become harder, at least to justify. We've seen incredibly steep price increases over the last 6 to 12 months. Most of you know that. The lead times are insane. They're up to a couple of years sometimes. I just spoke with someone who said they ordered something and they just got it 2 years later. There are mounting demands on power, cooling, and space. The density of systems and racks is just becoming untenable for smaller institutions to handle. It's very challenging to right size systems. If it's too small, it might not be that useful, but if it's too large, it's going to sit idle and won't be that productive. It's a very hard metric to sort of target there. And also, smaller institutions really often focus without a chargeback model. It's just not part of the culture there. So funding for these types of systems and services has to come from recurring capital funding or OpEx funding or startup funds with new faculty, faculty grants, institutional grants, and not recovered usage. This is something that is very distinct among most smaller institutions compared with a lot of R1s. And the cloud is not necessarily a solution, depending again on the metrics you look at and kind of what you use to compare against. For equivalent sustained workloads, the cost is 2 to 12x running something on-prem. And so there is this tension between, well, we can't really run it locally, but it's going to cost us a whole bunch of money if we have to go to a commercial cloud provider to do this. Now, as Marone helpfully alluded to, at smaller institutions, the line between teaching and research is effectively non-existent. They're basically one and the same thing. Faculty routinely bring their active research into the pedagogical sphere. They bring it into the classroom. Course projects, all of these kind of things. Research often draws from the expertise of the professor who's also the one doing the research. And it is the undergrads in these classes who are often doing the equivalent of grad student work at an R1. So undergraduates are doing it, but they often have less dedicated, less expected time to be able to make that kind of contribution. Also, something that's distinct among many smaller institutions, maybe not necessarily the R2s, but certainly the smaller ones, is that they cannot buy themselves out of teaching with a grant. It just does not happen. It's very common at R1s to get a grant. You buy yourself out of teaching. They hire an instructor, whatever it is. They're good to go. They hire a TA to do it. That does not happen at smaller institutions. So they can seek grants, they can get funding to do research, but they cannot necessarily use that to buy themselves out of their teaching. So they're still doing a full load of teaching, which can sometimes be a 4.3 or a 3.3, or if you're very lucky, something like a 3.2. But they're then having to do research and find a way to kind of integrate it into that. And so as a result of that, teaching becomes an extension of the research and vice versa. What this does is this, generally speaking, leaves about a 10-week summer window of intensive research. Ours started at Swarthmore and Lafayette College a week ago. This is when research is often done at smaller institutions. And so what we see is that the platforms in this world have to be dependable and low friction enough to use in a course to kind of have that touch point, but then potentially return to it after many months and pick it up right where they are. And they need that consistency. And this bursty cycle can result in distrust of non-local services. So, if we look at that as kind of the normal research cadence up there, it's going to blow up in June and July typically, and then pretty much be kind of steady state with long stretches of low intensity or idle kind of capacity. And so they have to come back to it when that window opens, and they need to be productive immediately on whatever resources they have. And so we see by talking to these faculty that what ultimately erodes trust in non-local services, they're concerned that, well, Exceed is great, Access is great, TerraGrid is great, whatever it is. But when that grant ends, what happens? If I'm dependent upon that workflow, if I'm dependent upon those resources, and that grant goes away, or I have to move my data, or I have to update my scripts, or I have to get a new login or something like that, all of that is going to erode my time to science. And that's not acceptable. They don't like different accounts. They don't like new logins, new environments, new shells. They don't like having to, write allocation requests and renewals and progress reports. Basically, anything that taxes a very narrow and tiny research window, they're going to find unacceptable. Now, I realize that these kind of steps are just de rigueur at larger institutions. They're accepted. They're just part of that world. But at smaller institutions, the same flexibility does not necessarily exist. Data and networking add their own friction. Storage is often scarce. It's expensive. It is potentially insufficiently performant for certain workloads if you even have enough of it locally. There's a great data management skills gap. Tools and expertise are thin. I'm going to refer to this a couple of times, but at many smaller institutions, research computing FTE is maybe less than 1. You're very lucky if you have a full-time FTE to devote to research computing, and exceptionally lucky if you have more than one. So the reality is that managing data can become an extreme challenge. And quite frankly, the motivation isn't there for the researchers. What's going to happen to them if they don't spend time researching data? They want to spend time doing more science, doing more stuff. They don't want to spend time cleaning things up, organizing it, making it searchable, findable, all of that kind of stuff. Commodity networking can be a problem at a lot of smaller institutions. There's often limited bandwidth, and this can restrict how effectively, shared or other resources can be used, especially in pedagogical contexts. I've talked to a lot of faculty. They're like, well, yeah, it's great if I have this shared data set, but if I want 30 of my students in my class to pull it down simultaneously locally, do some work, that's just not going to happen. I can't do that at the start of class when I have 50 minutes to teach them and do something productive. So this is a real challenge that we have got to find some way to deal with. We also often have limited or no controlled data capability. We're never going to have like an on-prem secure enclave, which is totally separate. And we are seeing, and by we, I mean me and several other of my colleagues that I speak with, we're seeing increasingly faculty want to do research that engages in some way with controlled data. This is a real problem for smaller institutions. The growth of team science also strains smaller shops. Team sciences, of course, typically involves extramural collaborations, but federation and resource sharing tools, the skills to fully leverage those, to fully implement those is often lacking at smaller shops. And the required workflows, the software, the environments, the dependencies, all of these things can be very challenging to stand up and manage locally when you're dealing with a sort of a team situation like that. Also, at smaller institutions, no two researchers are alike, and that is by design. Faculty researchers are hired to be distinct and unique at the institution for what they do, to provide that kind of broader coverage for the students. So there's very little overlap in expertise. So every project becomes a one-off. Every single project to support is something new. It's a new workflow, it's new tools, it's a new software environment. There are new dependencies to wrangle. And of course, a small researcher count kills economies of scale. It is very, very challenging to purchase equipment on a per researcher basis when you're looking at that kind of a number at most smaller institutions. New faculty often arrive with R1 expectations. I mean, we hire from larger institutions, which makes sense because the larger institutions are often the PhD granting institutions, and so we hire them. But recent graduates coming from that kind of pool, they're used to a richer resource ecosystem than they may have, and they want to keep doing research at that scale and style. They have momentum behind often their dissertation projects or the work that they've done, and so they expect to carry that forward regardless of where they are. This can be hard to do at smaller institutions. They often expect a certain level of support or certain software to be available or certain environment management and support to be there. They often will have lingering collaborations back with their mentor, back with their research lab, with other labs who were coordinating with their chair, for instance. And they want to continue those, and that's hard when you think of the federation that's required, the sharing, the shared security models, all of these kind of things. And so it makes for a very hard onboarding for these folks. They come in and they say, oh, well, I need to do X, Y, and Z. And we're like, well, we can maybe support B, but you want to do X, Y, and Z. So we'll try to get you there, right? We'll try to get to the bottom part of the alphabet with you. This is an interesting one that is often not considered as much. More compute does not necessarily mean faster science. So typically at a smaller institution, the kind of compute, the sort of churning of the stuff is done at a steady state. And then ultimately they have this long window of, well, now we got to look at what we've got. Like what has been output? What does this mean? How can I analyze this? And one time, I have just a quick story. One of my researchers I noticed was, on the system for a couple of weeks. She was doing very consistent work, and then she vanished for months. And I reached out to her. I said, is everything okay? Are the systems still meeting your expectations? Is there anything we can do? I was putting on my facilitator hat and trying to work with her. And she said, oh, no, it's great. I was able to do an entire semester's worth of data churning in like a week and a half, but now I have this mountain of results that I have to go through, and I don't quite know how to do that. So that's a really interesting challenge. I think that we would see a lot of benefit from somehow developing a better tool set for the interpretation and analysis phase. It's relatively easy to burn through your data, but then what do you do with the results? And that, I think, is a hidden cost that is a real challenging nut to crack. Speaking of facilitation and support, the best support model for smaller institutions, I'm convinced, is local. But the scale that research productivity requires is increasingly not. This is tough. So projects fail, or they at least fall short of their potential, not for lack of compute or other kind of computational resources like that, but for lack of local facilitation. Researchers expect bespoke service from colleagues they know. They don't want to, use a support portal that's, somewhere at some other institution. They don't want to, dial 1-800, I need help. They want to come and darken your door. They want to talk to you. They want to say, I understand that you understand my research. You know me. You know what we have here in this ecosystem. And so we need roles that are built to facilitate engagement with national resources as a first order approach. I think when we're talking about things like the OSPool, interestingly, very specifically, I think we need to reframe the pitch. So instead of saying we can do millions of tasks, which is true, that's great, we need to reframe it for smaller institutions. We can do one task very well up, a million times. That's a very small distinction. It's subtle, but I think that it's meaningful for smaller institutions. I think that these kind of services represent the lowest barrier to leveraging national services more. There's no proposal to write. This is very attractive to folks. This shortens time to productivity, even if it's only more or less in perception. It's free at the point of use, right? There's no capital outlay. There's no hardware to own. There's no cooling to deal with. There's no space to deal with. And so often it has, in my opinion, one of the gentlest learning curves to kind of get productive. And I think that we need to encourage this. But if we're being honest, there are barriers that actually limit adoption. Containers are a wall. They just are. Researchers and facilitators who are local helping those researchers need far simpler guidance for building and using containers. That is an easy kind of low-hanging fruit in some ways. But proprietary software gaps do exist. People still rely on Stata, Gaussian, MATLAB, Mathematica, these things. And these packages are often not available on national services. We know that it's not great for node spanning MPIs, tightly coupled large memory work. Those aren't good candidates for these kind of work. And a lot of our astronomers and stuff are doing that kind of work locally. And asking researchers to redesign a workflow, for instance, to implement checkpointing, which they are highly reluctant to do. These things risk productivity loss during that tiny research window, and that's a trade that many simply will not make. I'm going to skip this. This just basically says I think we need to start to, from a first order perspective, we need to start to route the work by its shape. We need to understand what they're trying to do and recommend solutions that are tailored to that work instead of trying to solve everything locally. And again, facilitation is this real lever, right? So less than 1 FTE for research computing very often. The scarce resource is human facilitation. We need to hire and define roles around facilitating engagement with national resources or with collaborative efforts as a primary job responsibility, not, oh, we will just do that when you need to burst, right? We need to say, no, this is the solution set and this is why it will work. And we often, in that case, have to be willing to handhold them a little more. It is a core tenet in research facilitation that we don't want to do it for them, right? We don't want to then own their workflow, right? And so we have to maybe be willing to get our hands a little bit dirty, which is maybe what is going to be needed to get them productive and started initially. As we see, hyperscalers, proprietary hardware, and the retreat from local compute can leave a project reproducible only in one specific environment. This, to me, is an extraordinary risk to reproducible science and the scientific method. This is awful. It is absolutely horrific. And because science that can't be rerun outside of a single vendor or environment isn't reproducible science. That does not work. And so the partial answer there is that we need to encourage as a first order solution portable, container-based workflows, other workflows that allow us to do shared infrastructure where we can, although we do need to acknowledge that doing that is challenging and portability is often hard and difficult. So as I wrap this up, basically 6 moves that I would suggest, right? We need to reassert the OSPool message and messages of similar services that we can do one task a million times, that these services are not just meant for the massive jobs that, we're just sending out, 200,000 tasks to do. Yes, we can even do your single task. So as you are working on smaller projects, we can support that. We have to make containers easy or at least easier than what they are. We have to have simpler, friendlier guidance and hands-on assistance for building and using them. We have to fund facilitation, create roles as a primary goal to engage with these kinds of services that are out there. And therefore treat national as a first order stopping point for jobs when it makes sense to do so. We need to build better analysis tools. We need to somehow attack that real bottleneck, which is the time to make sense of the results. which I think is almost intractable. I don't quite know what to do with that. And then finally, we need to improve data staging and sharing. We must be able to leverage data and move data in and out of both pedagogical and research environments at smaller institutions. That is absolutely critical if we are going to be successful in ways that don't tax the local either commodity or other connectivity when that is available. So the compute is within reach, right? Closing the gap to broader adoption is the work, and that work is mostly human. That is what we are faced with. So if we invest in facilitation, if we reframe the message, and we honestly meet researchers, especially from smaller institutions, kind of where they are and where their trust level actually is, I think that we can start to kind of pave the way towards greater success. So thank you very much. I don't know what kind of time we might have for questions, but I will be around. I'm here all week.
Question. Yeah. Great.
Hi, I'm not really familiar with OSPool, so could you tell me what it is that makes it less advantageous for multi-node MPI jobs versus a bunch of small jobs?
Well, I'm not probably one to speak quite as much to the architecture of the systems, but it is meant, usually jobs that get submitted there are smaller resource pool. They, require like single cores. They require smaller pools of memory. They're not necessarily meant, to span 20 nodes at once. Somebody has a hand up back there.
I'm not going to answer that question.
Oh, it's a separate question, but I don't think I'm wrong when I say that. It's just not meant, and also it's not necessarily meant for jobs that run for like weeks at a time. That's not typically where it is. Maybe Brian can chime in.
Yeah, I can give my 2 cents on that. So the OSPool is a distributed Condor pool across, depending on the week, 80 to 100 different sites across the US. So it can leverage contributed capacity that's opportunistic, people contributing because part of a grant, because they feel it's the right thing to do. So there's a lot of opportunities to share and tap into that shared resource. But on the other hand, if you have hosts that are partly in San Diego, partly in Nebraska, and partly at the New York, you're not going to reliably run tightly coupled jobs across all those. So it's a wonderful resource that we run, but it's really optimized towards these high throughput flows where you have many independent tasks, whatever many might be, as opposed to tightly coupled jobs that might be brittle in case if a single network or single data center goes down.
And also just in the scavenger notion, a lot of those pools are preemptible. So it's, you typically don't want to run these huge long jobs which could get cut off. So yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So where do you see Jupyter in that and things like it?
So we've seen a huge uptick in notebook-like tools in teaching. We find what is really helpful locally. This is something that, because of time, I didn't really get into, but things like Open on Demand, which, kind of provide an environment where notebooks and other graphical applications can be used, particularly in teaching. We find that those are a great resource for smaller institutions because it requires kind of less effort on the part of especially the students to get up and productive. So yes, I see them as a critical component in this, and a lot of smaller schools are doing incredibly creative things, especially with Jupyter, but also just with notebooks in general. So yeah, they're a critical part of that tool.
Is your analysis phase also computation?
Not necessarily. I mean, it can be, but it could be visualization. It could just be looking through outputs to say, what do we have here? And I just wonder whether there is a space for AI or other tool sets that can just help us make sense of this in ways that can, assist in drilling down into this. That's just the reality. A lot of people need a lot of time to just kind of look through the output of the computational phase to make sense of what's going on.
So since we're still working on our AV, I think we can take another question.
Yeah, sure. Oh, yeah.
So Peter asks from the Zoom chat here, is the move away from on-prem hardware reversing when it comes to GPUs for AI? Given the cost of frontier AI, I see more people trying to buy their own hardware to run OSS models. Is this likely to be a temporary or a durable trend?
So yeah, that's a very good question. And the problem is it smaller institutions in particular, and again, not all smaller institutions, but often the ones in the sub R2 size. How can you afford a GPU server that has 8, even GPUs that have, I mean, that costs as much as a house. That's literally not possible to do, and also to maintain the power, to maintain the cooling for that. We will have some researchers sometimes say, well, I'm just going to buy a GPU box for my lab, and it's like, do you have 1,000 watts of power to your wall outlet? Probably not. You're going to trip the breaker of the entire building when you turn that thing on. Literally, that happens, and so. We do see this. This is where things like NAIR, I think, come in. These national resources, which are purpose-built to provide those kind of on-ramps and environments, maybe we can't buy locally. Certainly, smaller institutions can. So is it reversing the trend? I think just the reality is that, yes, it kind of is. Yeah.
So I had a question.
Oh, no.
You know, so we're 2 weeks into a great new adventure with Fab Aid.
We are.
Hopefully all is good. We'll have 5 years. 5 years from now, hopefully at this meeting, how do we look back and say we made progress? Some things we don't control, right? We're never going to control the cost of GPUs. We're small fish. What does success look like, and what's the optimization function? What's the when we look at making progress on small institutions?
Yeah, so I thought about that. I thought about including a slide on what would success look like, and I think that I'm struggling with that a little bit because in my conversations with Marone and other people, we're trying to ask that exact question. Like, does it just mean that we have 100 small institutions adopting OSPool and other solutions like that who currently aren't, or is it that we have a very rich set of resources that smaller institutions can immediately follow to become more rapidly productive? I would like to see smaller institutions say that through the use of these tools, they can be more consistently productive in research than just in that 10-week research window. So I think that would be great, that if we have more frictionless solutions that let people say, I don't have to worry about devoting 100% of my attention to getting up and running on this in this incredibly narrow window, but instead I can give myself a little breathing space and integrate these more in my teaching and throughout the year. I think that would be a good measure of success, but how we quantify that, that's a different matter. So I think I'm finally relieved. So yes, okay. Oh, still not work. Okay, well, anyway, I'll be here all week.
Can I suggest what success looks like? I think success would be when more and more students at community colleges and non-R1s have experiential learning experiences in projects that include research and or industry involvement. Yes. And so that you have a total gray between education, research, and industry.
Yes, I would.
That is what success looks like.
Yeah.
Yeah, we see a lot of times people say, I want to teach using X data in my class, but the standard is too large. And so I have to use this sort of fake, kind of constructed data to just do something quick and dirty. So yes, I think if we can have that pipeline be more naturalistic, be more productive rapidly, I totally agree with that.
Yeah, I think I was going to suggest somewhat the same, that if 10 weeks is the, you know, the summertime, the research time that some of these professors get, you know, success can be something that involves those other 42.
Yes.
Because there's
100%.
rarely other places where you can get another factor of 5.
If we can smooth out that spike of research intensity, that would be a good metric of success.